I can't believe this is happening, I muttered under my breath as I stared at the thick legal envelope sitting on my kitchen counter. My grandma, the matriarch of the city's most prestigious hotel chain, had passed away 6 months ago, leaving behind not just memories, but a $50 million empire. I had been her only grandchild actively involved in the business, learning every detail, every decision, every secret corridor of power. She had always said I was the one who could carry her legacy forward. I believed her. But then, my mom remarried. Her new husband, Victor, had quickly made himself the power center in our family. Smooth, charming, and frighteningly cunning, he positioned himself as the logical manager of Grandma's estate. Suddenly, board meetings were dominated by him, decisions were made without me, and whispers of new contracts and asset transfers made my stomach churn. And now, staring at the envelope, I realized the extent of it. It was a legal notice. Victor had transferred control of the hotel empire into his name. Officially. My grandma's will had been overridden, or so it seemed. I sank into the chair, trying to steady my racing thoughts. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was personal. My mom, the woman who had promised to protect Grandma's legacy, had silently allowed her new husband to seize it. Victor's smug grin, during the last family gathering, flashed in my mind. He hadn't even tried to hide it. The audacity of a man taking what didn't belong to him, right under our noses, was infuriating. Yet, amid the shock, there was a flicker of unease. My grandma had been careful, meticulous. She had survived wars, economic crises, and corporate sharks. Could she really have left the empire vulnerable to this man's greed? The thought made my heart pound with both fear and anticipation. As I flipped through the envelope, I noticed a smaller note tucked beneath the formal documents. The handwriting was unmistakable, my grandma's. Victor may think he controls it all. But I've left him a surprise he will never see coming. Trust yourself and be ready. My pulse quickened. Surprise. She had done something, hidden something, that could change everything. But what? And when? I looked up at my mom, who was casually sipping her tea in the living room, acting as if nothing had changed. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. I glanced at Victor, who was leaning back in the office chair, radiating confidence, convinced he had won. And for the first time since Grandma's passing, I felt a shiver of hope mixed with suspicion. Grandma had never been careless, and if she had left me a way to fight back, I had to find it. Something was coming. Something big. And I would be ready. At first, I tried to believe it was all a misunderstanding. Perhaps Victor was genuinely helping my mom handle the estate while I grieved. But the warning signs began to appear almost immediately. Board meetings, which used to include me as my grandma's chosen successor, were now scheduled without notice. Decisions about renovations, staffing, and finances were made behind closed doors, and when I asked questions, I was given vague, dismissive answers. "Don't worry about it, you'll see the reports later," Victor would say, his charming smile hiding something sharp beneath. Then came the secret calls. I noticed him sneaking out of the house late at night, phone pressed tightly to his ear, whispering in tones that immediately raised alarm bells. When I asked my mom about it, she waved it off. "Victor's just managing some business details," she said, but her hesitation betrayed her. The truth was in her eyes. She didn't want to upset him, or me. Money transfers were another glaring red flag. My grandma's savings, which had always been meticulously divided for business and inheritance, was suddenly being redirected. Accounts that should have been accessible to me were now restricted. Funds moved to shell companies and accounts under Victor's name, each transaction raising more questions than answers. Even within the family, the imbalance was clear. My mom seemed to favor Victor's opinions over mine in every discussion. She praised him openly, sometimes in front of employees and board members, while I was subtly sidelined, my input brushed aside as well-intentioned but inexperienced. The emotional toll was crushing. I loved my mom, but watching her allow this without protest hurt more than Victor's audacity. My hands shook during meetings, my heart raced when I realized the magnitude of control he had seized, and nights became sleepless as I tried to make sense of it all. How could the woman who had raised me to value fairness and integrity allow this? How could she let her new husband assume power over the empire my grandmother had trusted me to inherit? And then there were the whispers from employees I had known since childhood. Small comments dropped in passing. Mr. Victor makes the final call now, or, he handles things differently than your grandma did. Each word was a confirmation of what I feared. They were already pledging loyalty to him, not to the family legacy, not to me. I began to feel cornered, like an outsider in a world I was supposed to lead. Every smile Victor gave felt calculated, every praise from my mother felt forced, and every decision they made without me tightened the knot of suspicion in my chest. Something wasn't right. And deep down, I knew this wasn't just about power, it was about betrayal. The question was, how far had Victor gone, and what had my grandma anticipated that I had yet to discover? It hit me like a thunderclap one rainy evening. I had been going through old files in my grandmother's study, searching for anything she might have left behind for me, when I stumbled upon a hidden folder labeled, "For Lena, only when needed." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were documents, recordings, and letters, proof of Victor's complete maneuver to take control of the empire. Contracts had been quietly rewritten in his favor. Hotels that were once under joint family ownership were being funneled into trusts with his name at the top. Even my grandma's personal accounts had been moved into accounts only Victor could access. Every legal loophole he had exploited was mapped meticulously. He had essentially stolen control of the $50 million empire without outright forging anything. I sank to the floor, disbelief rooting me in place. My mom had been complicit. Her signature appeared on several documents, always with a seemingly innocent excuse: "It's temporary, it's for stability, you'll understand one day." But reading the letters revealed her quiet acquiescence was no accident. Victor had manipulated her from the beginning, playing on her trust and love for him. Rage surged, hot and wild. I couldn't believe how blatant the betrayal was. My grandmother had trusted me, confided in me, and now her legacy, the empire she had built from the ground up, was being wrested from my hands. My own mother, the person I had counted on to protect her family, had let it happen. I felt my chest tighten. The betrayal was suffocating. All those years of learning the business, all the late nights with my grandma, all the moments she had whispered advice into my ear, they had led to this moment of profound injustice. I had been ready, and yet, Victor had thought he was untouchable. But then I noticed something else tucked inside the folder, a letter in my grandmother's unmistakable handwriting. "Victor may think he has the empire, but he has underestimated you. I've left protections in place. Watch, wait, and act when the time is right. Do not rush, patience is your weapon." My hands shook as I read it over and over. She had anticipated his greed. She had left me a way to reclaim everything. A surge of determination replaced some of the despair. I would not allow Victor to succeed. I would not allow my grandmother's vision, my family's legacy, or my children's future to be hijacked. The betrayal was clear, ruthless, and complete, but so was the path forward. And in that moment, I realized something critical: I wasn't powerless. I had the tools, the knowledge, and my grandmother's secret safeguards. Victor had taken control, but he had no idea what he was walking into. The question now was, how would I take it back? I sat in my grandmother's study long after the rain had stopped, staring at the letter in my hands. The betrayal still burned, Victor's audacity, my mother's quiet complicity, but beneath the sting, something else began to take shape, clarity. For months, I had felt powerless, like a spectator forced to watch someone else rewrite the legacy my grandmother had spent a lifetime building. I had allowed myself to sink into frustration and hurt, questioning why my mother hadn't stopped him, why the board hadn't recognized me as the rightful heir. But now, reading Grandma's words, I felt a spark ignite, a spark of resolve that I couldn't ignore. She had left me instructions, protections that Victor didn't know existed. Hidden clauses, secret accounts, leverage in contracts that only I could activate. My grandmother had anticipated greed, and she had prepared me for it. All I had to do was trust her, and trust myself. It hit me with a jolt. I had the power. I had been ready all along. The hurt and heartbreak didn't vanish, but they transformed into determination. I would no longer sit quietly while my grandmother's empire was stripped from me. I wouldn't let Victor's charm and cunning dictate the fate of what rightfully belonged to the family. This was no longer just about money, it was about legacy, honor, and justice. I thought about the countless hours I had spent learning the business, negotiating contracts, handling staff crises, walking the hotel floors at dawn. Every lesson, every challenge, every conversation with Grandma had prepared me for this moment. I wasn't just her heir on paper. I was her successor in spirit, capable of taking back what was ours. I remembered the way my mother had looked at me that morning, hesitant, guilt-ridden, yet silent. I realized that if I wanted real change, I couldn't wait for apologies or support. I had to act strategically, calmly, and decisively. Anger alone wouldn't win this battle. Preparation and timing would. I rose from the study, the letter clutched tightly in my hand, and felt a steady energy fill me. Every betrayal I had suffered had been a test, and now I understood the lesson. Patience, observation, and courage were my allies. Victor may have taken the surface control, but he had underestimated me. I whispered to myself, almost as if my grandmother were there in the room, he thinks he has won, but he hasn't even seen the beginning. And in that moment, the transformation was complete. The hurt remained, but it had sharpened into focus. I was no longer the betrayed grandchild. I was a strategist, a fighter, and a rightful heir prepared to reclaim everything. The game had changed. And the next move would be mine. I didn't confront Victor. That would have been a mistake. Men like him thrived on confrontation, they twisted emotions into leverage. Instead, I followed my grandmother's advice: watch, wait, and prepare. Step 1 was proof. Not suspicion. Not emotion. Proof that would stand up in a boardroom and a courtroom. I began quietly requesting access to historical contracts, under the excuse of continuity planning. Victor approved without hesitation, confident I posed no threat. That arrogance worked in my favor. Late nights turned into forensic work. I traced asset transfers, shell companies, and trust restructurings. Patterns emerged. Victor had rushed. He had relied on my mother's signatures and the assumption that no one would ever challenge him. But he'd overlooked something crucial: legacy contracts my grandmother had personally negotiated, clauses triggered only under hostile control transfers. Step 2 was allies. I reached out to senior executives who had worked with my grandmother for decades. I didn't accuse. I asked questions. Quiet ones. Their hesitation told me everything. Several had already felt uneasy about Victor's aggressive control, but were afraid to speak. I gave them something stronger than courage. I gave them a plan. Step 3 was the trap. My grandmother's hidden letter referenced a contingency review, something Victor would dismiss as ceremonial. I scheduled it as a routine governance audit, framing it as a formality required by international partners. Victor agreed instantly. Why wouldn't he? He believed the empire was already his. Behind the scenes, I activated the protections she'd built. Certain properties, our most profitable hotels, were never fully transferred. They sat in a legacy holding structure that required unanimous board consent and beneficiary confirmation. I was that beneficiary. Victor wasn't. Then I prepared the final piece, exposure. I compiled a clean, chronological case, emails, timestamps, financial flows, and legal clauses, showing not just control theft, but intent. Everything was backed up, notarized, and reviewed by an independent legal firm my grandmother had trusted for years. Meanwhile, Victor strutted through meetings, announcing expansion plans, speaking as if the empire were already reshaped in his image. My mother watched silently, torn between loyalty and fear. He felt untouchable. That was the most dangerous moment, when villains feel safest. The night before the audit, I stood alone in the lobby of my grandmother's flagship hotel, watching guests check in beneath the chandelier she had chosen herself. I placed my hand against the marble wall and whispered, "Tomorrow." Victor thought he owned the empire. He had no idea he was walking straight into a lock my grandmother had designed, and I was about to turn the key. The boardroom was electric. Victor, confident and smug, leaned back in the leather chair, convinced he had already won. My mother sat beside him, silent and tense, as if hoping the storm would pass. And I was calm, steady, and armed with the evidence my grandmother had left behind. I began by presenting the audit report. Every transaction Victor had made, every asset he had moved, every contract he had rewritten, everything was documented with timestamps, legal clauses, and backup proof. Gasps echoed around the room as I explained how his control was unauthorized, how my grandmother's contingency clauses had been triggered the moment he assumed unilateral power. Victor laughed at first. "This is nonsense. These are technicalities," he said, trying to brush it off. But I had anticipated that. I handed the independent legal review to the board members. The senior executives nodded in acknowledgement, their previous hesitation replaced by affirmation. Then I played the recordings, Victor's phone calls where he casually spoke about sidelining me, his boastful messages to my mother about taking full control. Each word pierced the room like a knife. My mother's eyes filled with tears as she realized how blatantly she had been used. "Victor," I said, my voice unwavering, "you thought you could steal my grandmother's empire. You thought no one would notice. But you underestimated her, and you underestimated me." Board members began questioning him, referencing clauses he had ignored and responsibilities he had bypassed. His confidence faltered, then crumbled. He tried to assert dominance, but every argument was countered with documentation, legal references, and testimony from long-trusted executives. By the end, Victor was exposed, not just as greedy, but as reckless and manipulative. His reputation within the company and the industry shattered. Contracts he had signed in his own name were nullified. Control of the hotels reverted legally and publicly to me. The empire that had been threatened was restored, and the board unanimously supported me as the rightful successor. My mother, ashamed and regretful, finally spoke. I should have stood up," she whispered. I nodded but said nothing. The focus wasn't on anger, it was on justice. Victor slumped, defeated, his golden aura gone. The humiliation was total, the exposure undeniable. Every employee who had feared his dominance now looked to me with respect and trust. The legacy my grandmother had built was not just preserved, it had been vindicated. I turned to the grand windows of the boardroom, sunlight flooding the room, reflecting off the marble floors and chandeliers my grandmother had chosen. It felt surreal, like a moment frozen in time, betrayal confronted, power reclaimed, justice served. As I walked out, Victor's defeated gaze followed me, but I no longer felt fear or anger, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that truth and preparation had triumphed. The crumbs had been reclaimed, and the rightful heir had taken her place. The days after the boardroom storm felt almost dreamlike. Victor, once the master of manipulation, was now a cautionary tale whispered among employees and industry insiders. His arrogance had been his undoing, and his control, a brief illusion, crumbled under the weight of truth. I walked through the hotels, my grandmother's legacy alive under my feet. Staff greeted me with respect and relief. Confidence had returned to the empire, because they knew justice had been restored. My mother approached, her eyes filled with guilt and gratitude. She didn't need words. Her presence alone acknowledged the mistake she had made and the lesson she had learned. My children, who had often accompanied me on these visits, now saw their family not as fractured by greed, but united by fairness. They understood, in ways words could not explain, that integrity and perseverance mattered more than momentary power. The empire wasn't just restored financially, it was restored morally, ethically, and emotionally. Victor's influence was gone. Contracts he had signed under false authority were voided. He had no platform, no allies, no authority left. Even his attempts to salvage his reputation with public statements fell flat. No one believed the man, who had tried to steal a legacy that was never his. And yet, the most satisfying part wasn't the destruction of the villain, it was the affirmation of my grandmother's wisdom. She had trusted me, prepared me, and left the tools to fight back in my hands. Her foresight, combined with my resolve, had ensured that justice wasn't just served, it was poetic. To those watching this story, have you ever faced betrayal that shook the foundation of your life? Have you had someone try to take what you had worked for, or what was rightfully yours? Share your experiences in the comments. I want to hear how you rose above it. And if you want to see more stories where preparation, courage, and justice prevail, hit that subscribe button. Because here's the truth. Those who underestimate integrity and patience will always find themselves undone. The empire, my grandmother's vision, and the respect of those who matter had been preserved, not by luck, not by chance, but by strategy, patience, and unwavering belief in what was right. Victor learned too late that greed can only take you so far. I learned that preparation and determination can take you even further. The legacy that was threatened not only survived, it thrived, stronger than ever. And as I looked over the city skyline from the flagship hotel's rooftop, I whispered to myself, a shiver running down my spine. Those who try to steal a legacy often end up as footnotes in its story.